One of the difficult aspects of podcast marketing and packaging in particular is the design element, specifically when it comes to the cover art. And the cover art is something that is hugely important. It is often the first impression that somebody has. Maybe they'll see the title first, maybe they'll see the combination of the title and the cover art. And so even if they do see the title first, they're going to see the cover art sooner or later, and it can work for you or against you. So hugely important in both attracting people. So when they see it, it stands out, it jumps out at them and pulls them in, makes them take a closer look. But it also has this huge modulating effect on their perception based on the title. And so they could see something and have one impression, and the cover art can drastically shift that one way or the other. And part of this comes down to legitimacy of like, does it look professional? Does the cover art imply that everything within the show is going to be of a high quality? But it can also do a lot in terms of the vibe and tone setting of the show. And I think that this is something that is somewhat underrated. So in this video, I want to talk through my thought process for designing cover art. And I hope that this will be helpful either for you to think about how you design your own cover art, but also how you think conceptually about visual design and maybe hand that off to another designer. So we're going to look at 3 examples of different shows that I either am or have been working on in the past, and we'll kind of talk through how those came together. So this is one of the most simplest. This is a show I've recorded 2 beta kind of episodes at this point, pilot episodes. I haven't edited them yet. It's trying to just kind of, is this going to work? And so it's essentially a like on-air coaching show. And I feel like this is going to be very editing intensive, this show, but I think it would also be a great show for the business. So we'll see if I can make this work. And I think there's a way to do it. But I've been thinking about the title, Podcast Marketing Hot Seat. So we've got somebody who's in the hot seat. And basically, these are the initial concepts I came up with. And so usually what I'll do, my starting point is almost always, these are kind of the iterations I went through. My default is often big text, clear, readable. That's where I start for almost everything. I've got my font that I use on basically everything. I've got my color palette, which we can see up here, some basic assets. And so working within these, I kind of know how to use these very limited resources, very text heavy, not a lot of imagery, to design something that looks at least clean. And so for me, the bar is really starting at like something that looks clean and readable and clear what it is. And so this starting point, works pretty well. And I tried out a few different variations here based on my brand colors. So I've got a purple background, yellow, and this kind of pale purpley pink type color. And at some point I added in the ears framework graphic here that I've got in the back that I've started using elsewhere across the brand. And so I wanted this to be subtle. I didn't want it to be super obvious, but I did want to have some allusion to it. And this is something that either you look at this and you're not really sure what it is, but later there's this aha moment kind of comes in when you see it on my website or somewhere else in my materials, that it comes up and you're like, oh, now there's that association. And so it just provides a nice kind of background texture that I was like, okay, I think it breaks it up. It makes it a little bit, there's something going on there that feels a little bit more, there's some depth to it. But I thought, okay, that's an interesting starting point, but it's not really doing anything for the artwork here necessarily. And so I don't think this is super strong artwork. At least it's clean and clear though. And potentially it could be fine for a B1. So then I started thinking about, okay, what other imagery could I get going on here that's simple, that I don't need to illustrate something, because I can't do that. That's one of my severe design limitations. I can't illustrate. Also, I don't really use photography anywhere in my brand. And so this may be changing a little bit, but typically, I have much more iconography. It's much more illustrative and more graphic designy rather than bringing in photography, which is a little bit interesting, seeing as I have a background in photography, but I have just never kind of brought that into typically my kind of podcast cover art. It doesn't really feel on brand for what I have elsewhere in the brand. And so typically I stick to stuff that's a little simpler, cleaner, using icons and stuff like that. And so usually I'll use a tool like Flat Icon. And so here I went searching for flame, for fire or something like that, and got a whole bunch of different flame icons, and then found one that like felt like it worked. And I thought, okay, this is actually getting into something to be a little bit interesting now. And I started playing with different color combos. And usually for me, like, you end up getting to the design. Like I always the hardest part is coming up with the first one. Like it's like once you get something down on the screen or the page, then it's like, oh, now we have something to start iterating with. But it's like coming up with like, what's my first layout here? And so I need to always tell myself, like, just get something, anything down on the screen, and then just start tweaking with it, make copies and play with it. And the other thing, I'll note, I'm in Figma here. We're going to look at Photoshop later on, which I use for some other use cases. So here we get into some different examples here. I really liked this kind of yellowy. It's part of my brand colors. And I thought, oh, that brings some nice warmth to it. I initially did like this one. It feels very stark, But then I thought, I think I want some more warmth. And here's, another area where thinking about like tone, and this is where color choices play a huge role, and obviously like imagery and iconography, things like that. And so I liked that the flame here provided this visual element of heat and hot seat and fire, and say, okay, there's this like visual theme that starts coming through with that, and you kind of pick up on that before you even read hot seat. It kind of accompanies it, and you're like, okay, interesting. Podcast marketing is very clear. That's what I want to stand out, because that's what's, my brand and what is hopefully going to catch people's eye that they're already looking for. And so then I thought, okay, the warmth now, that's an additional layer of communication that's happening here, at least when compared to something like this. And so thinking about like, there's the words here, there's the icons, and then there's also how does color play into the emotion, or which way it nudges people in their perception of what the show is. And so this is, I think this is my current favorite one so far. But then I decided, okay, let's just play around. I really like where this is. Let's start playing around with different layouts, different ways to use these elements that are already here. And so I did it for both of these, even though at this point I was pretty sure that I like this one. So then we tried looking at, okay, maybe we can just put that flame in the background here. Maybe there's a different layout this way, which like this also works. I don't quite like it as much as that top one, but it's still a clean, feels well organized, well structured, same elements there. This one I actually like as well. This one I think is kind of cool with the bigger flame, different layout here. And then this one's just bigger text kind of stretching across, rather than as opposed to the top one, which was a bit more centered, a bit more padding on the edges, which this one I think in some context will not feel great without that padding there. So this is kind of, a very simple process. This is where usually I start here, and we'll pull up my old show. And so if we look at this, you can see very much that this is clearly, I've got a style and it works within my limited design set. And so I basically started with, across all the brands that I do, I tend to use the same font. And then I've got, left align, big, bold text. I like that. And I like the confidence of like text heavy. I always like this in magazines and things like this. And so it's just a design that I like. And so incorporating it into a lot of what I do, feel like it works. And it's just so clear. The other thing that I don't have the file that I came up with this, but it's worth talking about this show. And so essentially here I'm starting with this, okay, wellness business, online marketing, stuff like that. And it was kind of a distinct brand. My agency, Counterweight Creative, had the same yellow and black kind of branding that we have, that is now a part of PMA. So this was a very much of a departure. And I knew that the existing branding did not align with the vibe of the show that I wanted to have, but I wasn't really sure what was the color scheme going to be here. And so this is something that I learned from my partner, Kelly, who has a long history in design. Is she was working with a nonprofit that created wells in Africa. And so what Kelly did was she took a bunch of examples of like the artwork and the design and the textiles of these communities, and started pulling colors from these different like samplings and patterns and things like that were representative of the communities where this nonprofit operated in. And so I basically did the same thing for this cover art. And so I thought, I want a feeling of vibrancy, of health. And even though this is an online business show, it's in the health space. So I wanted to have that feeling of vibrancy. And so what I did was I went to Google, and I think I looked at like vegetables or something like that, or like cornucopia or like something along those lines. And I just started looking at images of fruit baskets and stuff like this. And so I would take screenshots. I'd take screenshots of a bunch of these types of things and all this kind of stuff. And then I would just bring that into Figma or wherever, and I would just, start popping them in here. And now I've got some images, and then you can go in depending on what tool you're in. I think, is it I in Figma? Yeah, you can get, you can sample these colors, and you can start to see, I think I started with like a carroty type color, and obviously like colors in, or maybe it was probably tomato that I think I started with. I was like, this is a nice, like the orange is interesting. But I started looking at the colors, and I was like, what feels, vibrant? I thought, okay, the brighter, warmer colors, oranges, reds, those kind of feel vibrant. And so I basically sampled something like that, and then adjusted it quite a bit to get to like, now it's more of a salmony. It was originally more orangey, which I thought was like kind of working, but here more salmony. And then I would use a tool. I think what the one I use called is Coolors, COOLORS.co. And then what I do here, you can take a color. And so let's just pick a color like this. Here you can lock this color and then just press spacebar, and you can see the other colors around it. And you can just start to see like, okay, what do I like here with this pink? And often what I'll do is I'll set this to like black. black or white or something like that, something along those lines. And then I'll lock both of these. And then I can start to see some color combos because probably we're going to have a light and a dark. We're going to have the pink. And then like, I'm just looking for one other color that looks okay. And it's like, oh, maybe these two, this actually is, this color combo could work. And you can save these palettes. And so eventually I got onto something that was, I don't think it was this exact color, but it was like, oh, I like this, makes me feel of like Mediterranean Sea kind of sky, of like, that's a good, like vibrant kind of feeling. And so that's how I ended up with this color combo with this cover art. And then thinking about, the use here, I wanted to break this up. Just all white text wasn't really, that interesting, but really the focus here on the word better. The reason I chose that word in the title was there's a lot of heavy lifting that word does. And so there's partly building a better business that, is more successful for you. But the other thing that I wanted to lean into and was a big part of the show was like, what does it mean to do better in business? And a big part of that was around like thinking about the team culture you're creating, the impact on the world that you're having, and how better is a word that extends beyond just more money in the bank. And so this was a important word that I wanted to imply had more meaning than just like a better business here, more money and more followers, whatever, that there was more to it than that. So that was how this one came together, starting with this inspiration of what's the vibe here, vibrancy, thinking health. Okay, what represents that? And I started thinking, okay, well, vegetables, obviously, that makes sense. But then also thinking about like, the feeling of being on the Mediterranean coast, and like that feels vibrant and aspirational in a way. And so those two things kind of came together to create this cover art. So moving on to another one. Right now, I'm working on this one for the podcast roast one. And so I have this concept in my head that is this kind of like, I tried to do the same thing. I got a bunch of skewers you can see here and tried color sampling them. But this is where my skill at design, this is still a very early draft. I tried making a grill. And so I'm thinking this roast my podcast, there's a good concept here, but I can only execute it in a cheesy way. And so this is where I actually am going to hire a designer to actually do this. And I think I'm confident enough to say this is the concept I want, but we'll see about that. So a couple interesting things about this one to go through. My thought initially, so I went through a whole bunch of fonts on Google Fonts, and I was thinking like, I want something kind of chunky, something kind of food-like, something fun, something round, and like thinking like dough almost, or bread, like expanding on it. I had this idea for, the skewers, that the words would be on the skewers, on the kind of the shish kebabs on the grill. So I like that concept. And so then it was kind of like, what kind of letters feel a little bit chunky like that? And so basically just spent 30, 45 minutes going through fonts, trying to find something that looks interesting. And there's a bunch of these kind of fat letters here that I like, that I think could work, but ultimately settled on whatever this one is, which, now if I get somebody else to design it, they might do something else entirely. But kind of started here, and we'll see what comes of this. And so you can see some of my ideas here. So skewer, chili pepper, chicken leg. I still think there is a visual element like a chili pepper I think I want to have in here, because it's this idea of roasting heat, like it's spicy. There's maybe you think, yeah. So there's more that I want to add to this. I also had a really bad, I don't know if I still have this here, some really bad flames somewhere. Oh yeah, there we go. You can see it's very bad. I was thinking sriracha. So I think this is still actually an interesting, I kind of like the hot sauce idea or the chili. There's some ideas here that I think could be interesting, but I probably wouldn't do an actual photo. I would do illustrated. And so here, thinking about like what I wanted, I went through a bunch of shows, and I was like, this is kind of the vibe that I want. So it's kind of illustrated, it's bright colors, and so it feels kind of pop culture-y or broad appeal. And that was really the vibe that I wanted here, because I think Roast My Podcast could come across as really harsh almost. And I didn't want that. What I wanted was that this is going to be a fun show, that it's going to be, educational. You're going to learn something, and it's not going to be too you shouldn't be too scared of this show. I wanted to play into the humor a little bit. And so that was kind of the vibe I wanted to go for. And so these were just some covers that I thought were really well done, kind of similar vibe. And you can see none of these have anything to do with podcasting or marketing or anything related to the show, but they're a visual vibe that I thought will be helpful for the designer to understand the genre where I'm coming from a little bit in terms of design. And so this is always something that I think is worth doing when you're starting a new show and coming up with designs, of just like pulling stuff and being like, okay, let's just screenshot a bunch of stuff, pull it into one place so I can look at this. And then you can also start to, like, usually whenever I design a new website, I basically have somebody else's website that I like open in one screen. Usually it's like not a competitor or something, it's in a whole different industry. And I just copy stuff. And I'm like, okay, I like the way that their layout is here. Okay, I'm going to try and do that. How do I create that in my website builder? And then kind of it becomes more of mine over time as I kind of iterate on it, and colors are different and, the copy's different, all that kind of stuff. So this is where I started for this one. This will be stuff that I'll hand over to a designer at some point for inspiration, but that's how this one is coming along. The one other thing I'll add on to this from the handing off to a designer side of things is, if we're not designers, it is likely that we have actually poor visual taste. And so we may not want to push too hard. And typically, like, there are places where I know I have a clear vision for the design. A lot of times there's a couple shows that I'm kind of thinking about maybe developing at some point. And I'm like, I have no idea what the visual design would be. And so I would want to not give the designer anything. I would want to basically give them the brief, let them walk me through their process for finding out what they need to know to come up with a design, and let them come up with that visual concept. Because there are times when I'm able to come up with a visual concept and like get the pieces together. And there are other times where I'm just like, I don't know how to translate this concept into an image that is compelling, or a series of images or visual assets. And so something to keep in mind. It can be helpful to think conceptually, but we are probably usually better off leaving that to somebody whose brain works that way and is more abstract. And one of the big problems that a lot of people who are non-designers have is thinking way too literally with the imagery. And that's something that usually makes for cover art and design that feels kind of non-legitimate. It feels too cheap, kind of. Whereas I think good design is usually a little bit abstract. There's this kind of delight of like, oh, you can spot the kind of pattern, but it's not just so obvious. And so this is something where most of us are just not wired that way. And so be aware of that, and just consider that, like, okay, our design taste is probably not good. We can probably start with that assumption. And so if that's the case, we would probably want to defer to somebody else entirely and not give them too many strict boundaries to play within. Okay, and then the last one that I'm have currently just been working on is in Photoshop. And so here we have the new Scrappy podcasting branding. And so this applies both to the newsletter and I started this off for the Scrappy podcasting podcast, which is slowly coming together. And so basically I started off with a couple things up here where I had this kind of like, I like this kind of stay scrappy, this handwritten type stuff, thinking about that. And essentially where I've been stuck on this for months and months and months. And I've been wanting to update the overall PMA visual brand assets, because right now it's kind of boring. There's not really any distinctive visual assets. And so if we look at Podcast Marketing Academy, there's nothing, it's just very plain. Like, it looks clean and professional, but there's not really distinctive visual assets that people would remember. And one of the things that really got me thinking about this, I was been stuck for ages. And then I went through Louis Grenier's course, and he had this take on distinctive brand assets that he talks about, that it's not a bad thing. And it may even be desirable if your visual assets have nothing to do with your topic to some extent. They're meaningful to you in some way, or there's some inside story, but they don't like just align with your brand. And this was a huge breakthrough for me, because one of the things that I've always thought is so cheesy with podcasting is when there's like, it's just too obvious to have microphones and headphones and all this kind of like sound waves. It's like, it's too on the nose. And because it's on the nose, everybody does it. And so everybody all has the very same visual assets. And so I was like, what do I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but then what do I do? And so after I went through his course, then I started thinking, okay, yeah, the visual assets for PMA should be unique to me. They should have nothing to do with podcasting. They should have everything to do with me. And so then I started thinking, okay, like, well, what would it be? And it's taken, a year or more to start getting clarity on that. But I had that in the back of my mind. And so here's an example of Louis. He's got this kind of hyena. I think there's a story here behind it. He's also got a rooster somewhere. Oh, there was me. Hello. I think he's got it under here. We got the rooster. So he's got these kind of distinctive brand assets that immediately, if you see this around with the beret, so he's paying homage to his French heritage. I don't know what the rooster story is. I think he has it somewhere here, but it's kind of this rabbit hole to go down. And so here's this kind of distinct, style. And then these stickers that he's got of his faces, like, these are all, they stand out and they're memorable. And you got this guy down here as well, Roger. So this is where I started thinking about, like, okay, distinct visual assets that have something to do with me. What is kind of from my backstory? And one of the things that I did this a while ago, and so this is something Nate Cadillac, so something that he did, is talked about building out a mood board of everything that you like. And so I've done this a couple times in my life in various kind of classes and workshops. And I did it again recently a few months ago. And I was just like, what am I drawn to visually? And I just followed rabbit holes online and just collected a whole bunch of stuff. And I was kind of curious, just like, what is my visual taste and how can I start to decipher this? And I started just collecting all this design stuff. And you do see some trends emerge. I eventually kind of sectioned out into colors, things like that. There's a lot of like Bauhaus stuff that comes up again a lot for me. I really like kind of these geometric nature type things. There's lots of like minimalism type stuff that I like. Here we've got more geometry. I love these national park posters. This is a very kind of the style that I really like. We got more kind of geometry you can see here and more national park stuff. Here's more of this kind of nature geometry mix. I love these like almost Cold War propaganda-y style imagery. Those are cool. And that kind of bleeds into, there's a bunch of other stuff here. I love this kind of like subversive stuff. And this is where I kind of really started landing for the Scrappy podcasting stuff. Because I was like, I feel like it needs to be scrappier. I feel like, I have a background playing in like hardcore and metal bands. And I feel like a big part of my personality that doesn't really come through. And I feel like, I'm, friendly and chipper, but I also have this like kind of like backstory that I'm like, I like the grungy, like I want to bring that into the brand. And so this is where I started going back into this and I'm like, okay, I really like the idea of like skateboard culture, kind of like punk culture. Let's bring in some of that and start looking for inspiration at, what I've already in the past found the stuff that I like. And so I just went through here and I started screenshotting a bunch of stuff and thinking like, okay, let's just pull some of this into Photoshop and start kind of tracing these types of things and hand drawing some of this stuff. So it feels a bit scrappier. I'm not just taking the imagery straight up, but like this is where a lot of that inspiration came from. Oh, and the one other thing, I was stuck on font. And then this is from Tara McMullen. I really like her stuff right now. And I noticed that she was using, and I saw maybe somebody else with this kind of like paper cutout type font. And I was like, yes, this is what I like. And I really love this design from her that she's been running with this recently. And so I was like, this is the font that I've been missing. And the one other thing that also kind of unlocked me was seeing this show Never Post. I just love their cover art. And I like the way they've done this font. It's kind of like the magazine cutout ransom note type thing, but not quite. It's like, this is so cool. I just love this cover. So this was another kind of like design inspiration. So I started taking these things. I finally got kind of clarity on it. And then I took it into Photoshop and I started making a bunch of these just little drawings and things like that. And then doing this kind of paper cutout style background on them. So I was just like playing around with that for fun. And then I was thinking about fonts and I just did a bunch of like different drafts of seeing how things would work. So again, this was kind of like the first draft. I had two kind of Scrappies. I was like, which one do I like better? I was almost thinking, do I just do Scrappy, 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 Scrappy? And I was like, well, that doesn't really say what the show's about. What do I do with these kind of badges, these cutouts? And so I just kind of kept iterating, kept playing with different fonts, things like that. And you can see, some of these are more boring than others. This one right here, very kind of basic font. That's my typical Poppins font. Wasn't quite sure, playing with different layouts of the badges. So this is the one I've landed on now. And these are just subtle variations of color in a few things, some grays and versus black. And first I had this without this kind of like masking tape thing behind it. And then I added that. I thought, that's kind of cool. Makes me think of like, this is like a super nerdy. The inspiration for me is like on mixing boards at like when you're doing shows and things like that, or tracking in the studio, you put like masking tape across the whole mixing console and then write in what each fader is for the different tracks. So that was like my inspiration. I think there's, many other interpretations of that, but I was like, that's kind of cool. And bringing that in, that kind of permanent marker kind of hand-drawn feel. So I just drew all this. This was a font that then I did this paper cutout behind. And then thinking about the layout of these badges. And so there was no specific like meaning behind these icons. I was just like, these things are cool. I pulled some of them from my mood board and then I started just playing with them here. And now it's interesting because like I can ascribe meaning to all of these very easily. Like it's very easy to tie it in. And the more I think about them, I'm like, there is like, maybe there is some internal reason that I was drawn to these things in particular to have on the cover. And eventually the thing that I came to that I like is like, these all feel like scrappy, like subversive type iconography down here, which is like the foundation that gets you going. And then there's this like the love of the craft and like what you do, like that's the thing that like sets you free kind of. So this is my interpretation of the cover art that I kind of just, in a somewhat flow state kind of came to a little bit just through playing, which I think is usually for me how all good design stuff happens. So here's what I've kind of ended up on here, and then kind of transferred that into still kind of thinking about some of the other ways to use this in the newsletter, things like that. So hopefully this is helpful in thinking about my thought process behind design. And again, I think a couple things that I want to highlight is I think that you can get to stuff on your own if you're comfortable with the tools. I think that you get through a lot of iterations. Like I probably spent 10 or 20 hours just like working through this stuff over the course of a couple of weeks, and like kind of one full day just noodling on it for a while. And the other thing, again, like these graphics here have nothing to do with podcasting on the surface. And I think that's what makes this actually work. It's that it's not too obvious. It's not hitting you over the head. It is saying visually, if we're thinking about this idea of Scrappy, like going back to this idea of like show, don't tell. And so there's the word Scrappy in it, but everything about this screams Scrappy, and it screams like, oh, this is a different type of podcast about podcasting. And I want the content to reflect that. I want, the copy on the landing page to reflect that. And I want the design to encapsulate that. And so I want people's first impression to be like, whoa, I haven't seen a cover art like this before, let alone, for a show on podcasting. This, I think design does a lot of heavy lifting in terms of what it communicates. So thinking, not too obviously, a little bit abstract, bringing in imagery that might be unique and important to you, but not necessarily related to your topic. I would be interested to hear, I think a lot of good designers may differ on that, but they also have the skills to more subtly bring in imagery that ties into your topic that isn't just beating you over the head with it. So something to think about. And I would love to hear your thoughts after watching through this and think about your own design process if you do design anything yourself and how that might differ from mine, as well as if there's anything that this kind of unlocked for you in thinking about design for yourself, whether that's you doing it or bringing on somebody else to do it. So I hope this is helpful, and I will talk to you more real soon.